Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. And thank you so much for coming on what is such a beautiful day outside. But I think that we'll try to rival what's going on outside with what we show you on the screen today. For our first session, I would like to introduce my colleague, Marika Sardar, who is a research associate in the Islamic department and has been instrumental in the plans and preparations for our new galleries and is now deeply involved in plans for an exhibition on the Deccan that we'll be holding in 2014. So with no further ado, I'll hand the proceedings over to her and she'll be introducing the speakers for this morning's session.
Good morning. I'd like to add my welcome to Sheila's, and also before we get started, just note that for this particular panel, we're going to hold our questions until after all four speakers have given their talks. So this morning, we're starting with an in-depth exploration of one of the unique features of our collection, a room from Damascus, Syria, dating to the 18th century. In the previous installation, it was located just off the introductory room to our galleries, and it was a feature that visitors loved and remember very much from that installation. For the reinstallation of our galleries, the room was completely dismantled, conserved, and moved to a different part of the space to place it within its proper historical context. Kenney, a former research associate in the Department of Islamic Art, who was involved on the curatorial research into this room, will be our first speaker this morning. Now an assistant professor at the American University in Cairo, Ellen worked at the Met for 3 years on this and other new galleries projects, but the heart of her professional research lies in the Mamluk period. She has published and lectured extensively on the subject, in particular on the patronage of the Mamluk governor of Damascus, Tengiz al-Nasri. Today, she'll be speaking on the reflections of social identity and decorative tradition in the Damascus room. So good morning, Ellen.
Thank you, Marika, and good morning. So, what house did the Damascus room come from? Who first installed these opulently decorated wood panels in that residence? When this interior was displayed at the Met in the 1970s, curators titled it the Nuruddin Room. This nomenclature had attached to the room before it reached the museum, but it did not come from a known patron's name. Rather, it's generally agreed that it was derived from a famous monument, the 12th century Madrasa of Nuruddin Zengi, in the neighborhood where the house site was thought to have been located. In nearly 4 decades since the room entered the museum's collection, its patron and his palace have remained elusive. Fortunately, a great deal of other information has been learned about the room during this period. 2 major research projects have been particularly illuminating: the detailed analysis of the installed room conducted by Annie Christine Daskalakis Mathews in connection with her doctoral research in the 1990s, and the close study of the de-installed room conducted by the museum's conservation department under the leadership of Mecca Baumeister between 2008 and 2011. Daskalakis Mathews situated the room and its decoration in the context of similar interiors in situ and in museum settings, and provided the first published translation of its inscriptions. Her research explained the room's museum moniker and also publicized aspects of the creative license that was taken in the 1970s installation. Indeed, until her 1997 publication in the Met Journal, few but very specialized visitors would have known the extent to which the interior, known as the Nuruddin Room, was a composition of elements originating from various contexts. The museum's conservation department confirmed these findings, identified others, and revealed several areas of historic restorations. These 2 major research projects confirmed that the decorative woodwork of the room was indeed largely of a piece and it is on this woodwork that I will focus this morning. Let's see. And here we have a view of the former installation of the Damascus room, or the Nuruddin room. And this is a view of the conservation project sort of in progress. Just as the period since the room's acquisition has witnessed rediscoveries about the room itself, it has also seen new developments in the study of its historical and cultural context. In 1970, most historians of the Middle East still viewed the 18th century as an advanced stage on a decline model whose events, when analyzed, spelled only an inevitable demise of the East and rise of the West. The approach to architecture of the Arab provinces of the later Ottoman Empire generally mirrored that decline theory, emphasizing its inferiority to contemporary works in the imperial capital and to local antecedents of earlier ages. And in the field of Arabic literature of 40 years ago, post-classical Arabic poetry, of the sort inscribed on the walls of the museum's room, was especially unloved and neglected, making it difficult to identify, appreciate, and contextualize architectural inscriptions aside from those that bore Quranic passages and historical data. During the last 4 decades, however, scholarship has forged new paradigms for all of these somewhat maligned subjects, recasting the 17th and 18th centuries in light of emerging mercantilism, globalism, and local political economics. Recent studies, such as the 2-volume Survey of Damascus by Stefan Weber, reframe analyses of provincial Ottoman architecture in terms of receptivity and versatility, and reflect a burgeoning appreciation of domestic architecture, both in its own right and as an index of social distinction. Today, new approaches to Arabic literature are even beginning to validate the study of post-classical poetry and to examine the roles that it played in contemporary life. Thus, while the room's original patron and physical contexts are still shrouded, its historical period and cultural setting have come into sharper focus. One of the goals for the interpretive material about the room developed for the New Galleries project was to reflect this new focus. Today, I would like to explore an aspect of the question further. Specifically, what can the room, and especially its inscriptions, tell us about our anonymous patron, and how does that story relate to the narratives of the room's historical context? First, a very brief overview of the interior itself. This reception room was comprised of 2 zones, an antechamber in the foreground, and a raised seating area, or tazar. The ensemble of woodwork includes the ceilings of these 2 zones, along with their cornices and corner brackets, and the wall paneling of both zones, along with its built-in recesses for shelving, cupboards, shuttered windows, a double-leaf door, and a decorative niche, or masab. Designs executed in the Agence technique of painted, glazed, tinned, and gilded gesso relief cover this woodwork with floral and vegetal motifs, flower-filled vases, fruit arrangements, vignettes, geometric designs, and calligraphy. Most of the calligraphic decorations in the room are poetic verses, which have been found on the ceiling cornice, and the wall cornice, and in paired panels above the wall recesses. As I've mentioned, Annie Daskalakis Mathews discovered some of the room elements in the 1970s installation to have been installed out of place. The conservation department confirmed this and also learned that while most of the decorated wood paneling belongs to the same phase and can be dated by inscription to 1707, some elements were replaced, evidently when the room was still in situ. These discoveries have a direct bearing on our understanding of the room's inscription. For one thing, a standalone couplet located on the rear wall, and it's back here, was determined to be part of a later renovation, not contemporaneous with other verses, and thus not part of the original epigraphic program. Since the panel on which these verses appear probably replaces a wide, tall, arched opening, which customarily occupied this position in 18th century interiors, there would not have been space for text in this zone originally. This means that the new couplet did not replace earlier inscription panels in that section. Also, a few of the verses were out of order as a result of this rearrangement of the room's elements in the 1970s installation. The placement of the wood elements has been rectified in the new installation, and as a result, the text of their inscriptions appear in the proper sequence. This has clarified some of the more confusing passages and facilitated the new literary translation based on the correctly situated panels that Dr. W.M. Thaxton undertook for the department. Lightning saw the darkness frown and smiled. It skimmed and wafted over the flowers of the hills. Dawn's forehead shone through the forelock of darkness, and it pierced the whiteness of teeth in the fruit of red lips. Thus begins the poem inscribed in the Tazar ceiling cornice of the museum's Damascus room. Around this zone. Which continues with a dramatic description of a rising dawn as it illuminates a terrestrial landscape of gardens and trees. Both the sunrise and garden are personified through metaphors, linking elements of nature to the body, human expressions and actions, and to garments. For example, the poet describes morning rain showers that moistened the cuff of earth's sleeves and adorned the garments of spring encampments with stripes. It cannot be claimed that the imagery of the poem and the motifs represented in the ceiling were directly keyed to each other, but they are certainly complementary. The variety of flower blossoms, leafy greenery depicted there relate to the spring flowers and blooms in the verse. The centralized composition might recall a formal garden, and the undulating gold band around the central ceiling panel could conjure a water channel or river. The polychrome metallic luster of the gilded, tinned, and glazed ajami work evoke a verse that begins, "And the silver of the shade mixed with the gold of the lightning." On the wall cornice, the verses introduce calligraphic imagery into the poem, and the personification of dawn, with the personification of dawn writing gilded lines on a palimpsest of air, dotted with silver from the drops of clouds, thus creating an especially delightful interplay between the actual calligraphy and text, the image and the imagery. The poem then shifts to praises of the Prophet Muhammad. At first, this transition seems abrupt, but after just a few verses, the panegyric is linked with the description of the first section. As the praises begin to incorporate references to the imagery employed earlier, this linkage starts subtly by recalling the garment metaphor of the sunrise description. Thus, the prophet is described as one who dons glory and power as striped finery in which beauty is embodied. In the next verse, the linkage comes head on. Were it not for the prophet, the dark would not be illuminated, night would not blossom, and slime would not bring forth greenery. Thus, retroactively, dawn, described for its natural wonder in the ceiling verses, becomes a metaphor for the prophet himself. The tone then changes from praise to supplication, and the poet speaks in the first person, begging for the prophet's intercession and God's mercy at the gate of judgment. The poet addresses a plea that his prayer be answered directly to the master of the earth and sky, thus situating the sunrise and the garden imagery into the context of all creation and its creator. Finally, the wall cornice ends with an admonition to pray for the chosen one and his companions whenever the lightning sees the darkness, frown, and smiles, thus returning to the lightning metaphor of the opening lines. With the transition from the cornice zone to the wall panels, the theme shifts again, and the verses follow a different rhyme and meter than those in the two cornices. For the first few verses, the poet addresses the house directly, extolling its magnificence and the qualities of its patron. Hands of nobility erected you in the highest dignity. Those seeking refuge have an abode that protects them from destruction. And later, rejoice in your loftiness, for he who built you surpasses the planets and stars in glory. The next few couplets belong to panels relocated into their original configuration in the new installation. Consequently, Dr. Thaxton's new translation conveys a more coherent rendering there than was possible earlier. It is on these verses that I would like to concentrate in particular. Here, praise of the patron continues with a celebration of his genealogy as follows. A family branch which traces its roots to the most noble of men derives more significance from high-born glory than anyone who wears nobility as a cloak. Next, the poet goes on to boast that this great family reduced to subservience not only the office of vizier, but also the prideful, and time itself. The wall inscription includes a single text panel located above the masab, reading, in its towers are assembled splendor and generosity. Through Muhammad, the abode of noble qualities was established, followed by, and that's this panel here, followed by the date of 1119 Hijri, corresponding to 1707. It was standard for domestic interiors of the Ottoman period to bear inscriptions, typically incorporated into cornices and above-wall recesses, exactly as they are in the museum's Damascus room. Comparisons with the preceding Mamluk period are difficult to draw because of a relative paucity of surviving comparanda. But more broadly, calligraphic friezes had long featured in decorative programs of palace architecture throughout the Islamic world. The content and style of the Damascus room poetry also appear to be perfectly consistent with the kind of verse found in other interiors of the period, not only in Syria, but in Egypt and Turkey as well. In a very recent development brought about by the timely intercession of Ankasharas, we've learned that Dr. Claudia Ott has made a tentative attribution of this poetry. She cautiously identifies it as a section of a panegyric in praise of the Prophet, composed by Ahmed al-Khalouf, a Tunisi, who flourished in the late 15th century. And we're very grateful to Dr. Ott for sharing this information with us. This category of literature appears to have been the favorite source for residential inscriptions of our period. Especially popular were the earlier works of al-Busiri, whose Qasida al-Hamziyya and Burda, known in translation as the Mantle Ode, were frequently excerpted and adapted for use in domestic spaces. It was also customary for residential inscriptions to include prayers, especially supplications for the Prophet's intercession. Exaltation of the house and its owner was a common motif as well, and harks back to a long tradition of descriptive poetry, or wasf, especially dedicated to the subject of palace buildings and builders. The very conformity of the room's poetry to the norms established for residential inscriptions in the Ottoman period might suggest it merits little attention. However, I believe there's much in this verse selection that can shed light on the world of the room's patron. At the very least, the content identifies the patron as a Muslim. Daskalakis Mathews has pointed to the bivalent possibilities of the name appearing in the poem's close. Through Muhammad, the abode of noble qualities was established. Because of the pious content on the wall cornice, one might assume this invocation refers to the Prophet Muhammad, but it may have had double meaning if the patron's name also happened to be Muhammad. Given the popularity at the time of literary riddles and various forms of encryption, such wordplay would not have been out of place. But why would the patron have wished to be so coy about providing his full name? A simple explanation may be that he was credited more fully elsewhere in the house. An interior as refined as this one undoubtedly belonged to a very grand house, and such residences invariably boasted more than one such hall, sometimes 3 or 4. It's possible, therefore, that the patron included his name elsewhere in another part of the house, so that it sufficed here to refer obliquely to his personal name. This brings us back to the Ka itself. How would such inscriptions have been experienced? How legible were these calligraphic friezes from the vantage point of the house's occupants and visitors? And how likely is it that they were actually read? One device that aided legibility was the consistent use of a medallion to frame the epigraphy. The clarity of the script and the sheen of the gilded letters against a matte ground color, once a brilliant blue, now blackened with varnish and time, enhanced the poem's visibility, at least during daylight hours. Noha Abu Khatwa has reported that such wall texts in later Cairene interiors actually were recited within the rooms. I've not encountered references to this practice in 18th century Damascus, but it was reception rooms like this one which would have hosted a type of gathering known as the majlis. Residential majlis gatherings ranged from Sufi-oriented devotional assemblies to more secular events along the lines of a literary salon. In both cases, the recitation of poetry figured prominently as an activity. Arab cities in the 17th and 18th centuries witnessed a fluorescence of interest in poetry, both old and new, fostered by such factors as the increased literacy of the age, the proliferation of Sufi orders, and the patronage of coffee houses. Against this cultural backdrop, it's probable that the poetic texts on interiors like this one were both legible and accessible to 18th century visitors who would have recognized some of the verses as excerpts of famous poems known to them by heart, and others as original compositions referencing a body of well-known literature. The fact that this inscription and others like it contain occasional errors and omissions plagues readers and translators today, but it may have been of less concern to contemporary visitors to the room, whose familiarity with the source texts would have enabled them to experience the inscriptions in a meaningful way, even without a faithful transcription from the page to the wall. Furthermore, even if a first-time visitor to the room had been unable to make out parts of the text, his host would have known its content and could have bridged any gaps in its legibility, at the same time demonstrating his own literary taste and abilities. With this context in mind, let us return briefly to the inscriptional content of the museum's Damascus room. While the verses in the room do not identify the owner, there is a section of the text on the wall panels which does point to his social identity group. After extolling the patron for his generosity, the poem continues, "A family branch which traces its root to the most noble of men derives more significance from high-born glory than anyone who wears nobility as a cloak." Here we find an explicit claim that the patron considered himself a sharif, tracing his lineage to the Prophet Muhammad. Moreover, the poem not only claims noble ancestry to the owner, but also elevates him above those who would wear nobility as a cloak, a remark aimed directly against false claimants, thus expressing class distinction as well as praise. The selection of the following verse, which speaks of this distinguished family making the office of vizier subservient, time a serf, and the proud enslaved, also conveys an intriguing specificity, as does a phrase slightly later that praises the patron's achievements in spite of his enemies. Could this selection of verses have referred to some political struggles of the day from which the room's patron or family emerged victorious. Against the dramatic backdrop of shifting power relationships characterizing the late 17th and early 18th century in the Ottoman provinces, this concern with lineage and dominance takes on particular significance. In the Near East, at the beginning of what some scholars have termed the global 18th century, fortunes were being newly made through mercantile activities, local social arenas were being reorganized, and new strands of cosmopolitanism were being expressed in the visual arts, including domestic architecture. In Damascus, power struggles were playing out between two main factions, an old guard made up of an alliance of local notables and assimilated Turks, and a new one composed of imperial forces recently dispatched from Istanbul. Modern historians of this period of Damascus history have dubbed it the Age of the Ayan, referring to the class of local notables. There and in other Arab provinces, the question of lineage constituted one of the hot-button issues of the day. The practical advantages of Sharif status were clear. Ashraf benefited from stipends, tax privileges, and political favors. They enjoyed higher social esteem than did commoners, wielded greater credibility as legal witnesses, and benefited from better eligibility in marriage alliances, for example. Their status was expressed with the sartorial distinction of wearing green in their turban, a practice which only registered Ashraf were entitled to. With the increased importance of noble lineage came numerous incidents of false claims of nobility and a suspicious boom in the ranks of Ashraf. And in the years just prior to the date of the museum's room, the centralized registry in Istanbul that had monitored the legitimacy of lineage claims had been dismantled, and the task had been transferred to local bureaucrats in provincial cities. The idea that the content of such domestic inscriptions, though abiding by traditional themes, was not strictly generic, is borne out by a number of other interiors in which the epigraphic content appears to be similarly customized. It is evident from several examples that domestic inscriptions sometimes serve as a venue for patrons to publish their affiliations and status. And I should point out that the family branch verse is located right near the door in a highly accessible spot. As Stefan Weber has demonstrated for slightly later period, such inscriptions were just one of the means by which the house became a marker of social position. Weber also makes the critical point that displays of this nature played not only a public role but a private one. We used to think of aristocratic courtyard houses of this period that they were clearly delineated into public versus private zones and strictly segregated by sex. This impression had been reinforced by the use, more popular in secondary literature than historical sources, of the terms haramlik and salamlik to describe these zones. Recent studies suggest that the rooms in Damascus houses were not clearly defined along such lines, but rather that their usage was contingent upon circumstances. Thus, the audience for the wall inscriptions in the museum's Damascus room was not just visitors from outside the family, but also the family itself. Furthermore, this family audience would likely have been multi-generational, including the elders and children of the patron. So claims such as those contained in the family branch verses would have bolstered the self-image, or the self-location, as Weber puts it, of the owner and his family in their own eyes, as well as public opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Our next speaker is Annie Christine Daskalakis Mathews, who has a long background in the study of Damascene interiors, having completed her PhD thesis at the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU, on this topic. This work surveyed several Syrian period rooms, placing them within a broader historical context, as Ellen mentioned. While a fellow here at the Metropolitan Museum, she studied our Damascus room in careful detail, discovering several features about the room's original configuration that helped the department reconceptualize the reinstallation of this room in the new galleries. Recently, she has been at the Louvre as that museum's Department of Islamic Art constructs its own new galleries, and she was involved in the project to reconstruct the Mamluk portal in its collection. She also lectures at the American University in Paris. So please join me in welcoming Annie Christine.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, the Damascus room is among the earliest surviving Damascene interiors, and certainly one of the finest. I'm glad to see that in its reinstallation, the museum took up, well, an earlier suggestion to change this confusing name of Nur al-Din room for the more dignified term of Damascus room. It is typical of the kind of interiors that flourished from the 17th century to the mid-19th in practically every important house of Damascus. Because its decorative style is so distinctive, as significant as any other historic style, I decided it deserved a name of its own and settled upon Ablak Ajami, a compound of two old Arabic terms, Ablak to denote the stone elements and Ajami to indicate the woodwork. Ablak is about stonework and hails from several pre-Islamic cultures. In the Middle Ages, it became synonymous with great Syrian architecture of the Ayyubid and Mamluk dynasties, embracing all the kinds of stonework used to enhance the exterior and interior surfaces of Damascene houses. It included bands of alternating stones and various mostly geometric or stylized designs inlaid in stones, marble, or colored paste. Thus, within the larger decorative scheme of Damascene houses, Ablak stands not only for mineral decoration, but also for those elements that were associated with long-established local traditions. However, it's not the Ablak part of the story that I wish to discuss today, but the Ajami. Ajami is a term that comes from the root meaning non-Arabic, foreign, also signifying Persian. In the Damascene context, it is the first two of these meanings that seem to have been retained. Where interior decoration was concerned, Ajami denoted a technique, a specific ornamentation, as well as all the interiors decorated in this manner. Although Ajami was used in the Mamluk period, it rose to its most sophisticated levels in Syria during Ottoman times, and within Syria, it was in Damascus that it excelled. Technically, it was a laborious method of working wood in relief with several painting phases applied. The special aesthetic of Ajami rooms offers contrasts of shiny and dull areas, glossy glazed paints, and matte or silky colors. Light is reflected from numerous polished surfaces painted in metal leaf or foil. Walls appear as if formed of soft textiles, echoing the real fabrics in the room. But the technical aspects of Ajami have been expertly treated by Mecca Baumeister, who will speak to you after me, and Anke Sharaf. My focus today will be the decorative shell of Ajami and its connections beyond Damascus. The museum's room presents a fairly complete ensemble of a typical twofold Damascene living and reception room called a ka, the form of which comes from Mamluk Egypt and Syria. This lofty hall was divided into a lower threshold part called the ataba and a raised sitting area, the tazar. In Damascus, such warm wood-clad rooms were mostly used in the colder months and were therefore located on the northern side of courtyards to benefit from a southern exposure. The cool stone or marble ataba was a sort of antechamber or circulation area where visitors would be received, shoes would be left, and servants would remain in attendance. The tazar, on the contrary, was the living and reception area proper. Despite the great variety of rooms, the layout of paneling divisions follows certain conventions that give them a consistent appearance. In general terms, on the wall level, the horizontality of the paneling, or halka, is broken up by broad vertical units or bays that include cabinets, bookcases, doors, shutters, and open shelves. themselves separated by narrower vertical panels. All these elements of the halqa begin at the same height from the floor, and it's nice to see that the museum's masab, which you see there, has been restored to its original placement, to its correct alignment. One special panel not found elsewhere in Islamic interiors is the overdoor, which, as its name implies, is found over the entrance door on the inside of the Ka. The wall paneling culminates in a concave cornice. Some cornices had a kind of shelf on top, used to display precious objects, as the one that belonged to the museum's room, which has recently been rediscovered and is at NYU's Kevorkian Center. Above the paneling is a wide blank wall zone that would add height to the space. Ceilings are usually of two types, one beamed over the ataba and one flat or appearing to be coffered over the tazar. These are separated by a great lofty arch, in the most lavish Kas like the Metropolitans, also made of wood. Ceilings too have cornices and curved spandrels called rakabat at the four corners of each ceiling. The designs of flat ceilings like the museums seem to evoke carpets of geometric and astral designs known as compartment rugs, and the rakabat were perhaps thought to resemble gathered curtains. Ajami motifs, as opposed to those employed by Ablaq, are curvilinear, realistic, and floral. Against a background of frequently of light green, which is nowadays obscured, in fact, really gone. We can't experience them in their light green background. Arabesques and small flowers form the background of the primary Ajami ornament, which involves a large variety of vessels containing flower arrangements, like you see here, or fruit and vegetables, and small architectural landscapes, which you see up here, there, for example, there, and of course, poetic inscriptions. All these images combine to suggest the outside world beyond the Ka. I'll just go back a couple of steps. Arabesques and floral motifs were traditional elements found throughout the Islamic world. Likewise, inscriptions were common on all manner of buildings. Vases, fruit bowls, and landscapes and cityscapes were also non-indigenous, long employed by both Islamic and non-Islamic art. Their antecedents are too numerous to point out here. However, one can say that their origins were Ajami or foreign. In fact, it is this thematic repertoire or iconography of Ajami painting that most strongly links it to decorative styles beyond the city's frontiers, for they bring the outside world inside the Ka, evoking nature, and in particular Damascene nature and its paradisiac associations. Damascus and its countryside have been compared to paradise since ancient times. This reputation was firstly due to its river, the Barada, and secondly to its gardens and surrounding cultivated zone. Damascus gardens figure in texts from as early as the mid-9th century BC, with many accounts existing by medieval Muslim authors and later European visitors who remarked on the variety of trees, fruit, vegetables, and, of course, flowers, and the products like sweets and perfumes that ensued. Besides many Quranic associations of gardens with paradise, gardens in general have always been considered as the highest form of beauty, the ultimate in luxury and pleasure in the Islamic world. But it was not only the natural landscape of Damascus that struck visitors. Its cityscape was just as responsible for forging its renown. And among the great buildings of this city, travelers mostly admired its houses and palaces, and the sophisticated, elegant, and sweet lifestyle of its residents. In the 17th century, and especially the 18th, accomplished interiors were being created from the Ottoman Empire to the kingdoms of Europe to the American colonies, all seeking to display the affluent and aesthetic discernment of their patrons. So on the broad international stage of interior decoration, where do Damascene rooms like the museums belong? For many, the Metropolitan's Damascus room is an Ottoman room. Doubtless, this is the case if one looks at its date and provenance, as Damascus was indeed a city within the larger Ottoman Empire. In terms of decoration, however, we find more complex elements at play. In the first place, the overall layout and design of a ka does not correspond to the typical Turkish room. In fact, even 200 years after the Ottoman conquest of Syria in 1517, Damascene houses had not changed to reflect any of the known Turkish house types, and the ka type of room remained unaltered since Mamluk times, with no comparable space in the Turkish house. The key motifs of Ajami decoration can be seen in many places and epochs, but they have mostly been perceived as Ottoman and by extension Turkish. However, this is not the case if one looks more closely. Turkish cityscapes and landscapes, for example, are usually topographical, showing known cities or religious sites, and large panoramas placed on the upper sections of walls like friezes or panels, not like the small vignettes on Damascene paneling and ceilings. Flowers in vases are certainly found in Turkish houses, but in the 18th century they are the culmination, not the beginning, of a fascination with such motifs already experienced in the 17th century, as one can see in Damascus. The paintings of Sultan Ahmed III's so-called tulip period, which is from 1718 to 1730, are the most famous Turkish examples. Although the themes are similar, their execution and placement is once again different, and so is the painting technique. Damascene vessels are more tactile, due largely to the relief technique of Ajami, and in Damascus there is a preference for golden vases and bowls over porcelain, or motifs are often set in cartouches, also painted in gold. Finally, inscriptions don't have the same prominence or intimate connection to the Turkish interiors as they do to Damascene ones. Now, to define this international character of the Damascene style, I will look first at Greece, which displays striking visual links to Damascene Ajami decoration. The important commercial towns of Ambelakia in Thessaly and Kastoria and Siatista in Macedonia had wealthy houses built by well-traveled, educated merchants who maintained close ties with merchants in France and Germany. Though the layout and general articulation of these interiors have more in common with Turkey, their paintings find their closest correlations with Damascus. We find, for instance, the same distinct preference for fruit and flowers of a wide variety, which continues into the 19th century, as opposed to Turkey, where the variety is more limited, and so is the time span. Images of fruit especially underscore the ties with Damascus, as fruit is not seen so much in Turkey, except in Sultan Ahmed's fruit room. And I could have shown you many, many examples of watermelons. There is a long collection of Damascene and Greek watermelon images, but I just picked these two. Greek houses employ also cityscapes in large panoramas in the upper wall zones, something rather rare in Damascus, but common in Turkey. But they also have small anonymous vignettes in cartouches, as is very common in Damascus. And there are chromatic similarities between Damascene and Greek paintings, with a preference for gold and golden backgrounds and warm tones of reds, oranges, and olive greens, and there are affinities in the actual execution of individual flower and fruit motifs. Finally, some of the less common motifs are shared, like this cornucopia, which we have in the museum's paneling, or a strange combination of life-size fruit flanked by small-scale buildings, which we have in the museum's overdoor, and we find also in Greece. How can one explain these connections Were there traveling artists, common models, or was it the choices of cosmopolitan patrons? Damascus had a strong Greek presence, and international merchants could share through oral descriptions, engravings, objects, or fabrics, things they had come across elsewhere. Local artists would then have to interpret these ideas according to available resources, talents, and craftsmanship. The affinities between Greek and Damascene painting do not seem to be based specifically on Turkish models, but lead us to posit, perhaps, a common source of inspiration outside the Ottoman Empire. Many foreign travelers admired the paintings of Ajami interiors and compared them to what they had seen in Europe. I'll come back to this. And in particular in France. Europe has nothing more magnificent, wrote Alphonse de Lamartine about Damascene cars. Inasmuch as France had a privileged association with Damascus, and inasmuch as it held a leading position for setting the taste in Europe, France offers the premier European example with which close decorative connections can be established. Since the 16th century capitulations, whereby Ottomans signed treaties with European powers, the French were favored over other Europeans in Damascus. And in the 17th century, the privileges granted under the capitulations were expanded. But what were the means by which Damascene patrons and artists were able to experience contemporary French decoration? It must have been a combination of factors. French prints in books, such as these, or sheets may have been a point of departure and instruction for local artists. Since the 1620s, books of engravings were being published in Paris, illustrating patterns and ornamental features of interior decoration. By the 1640s, these were being copied and sold abroad. And today, in the realm of trade and taste, cosmopolitanism united great cities, with their citizens seeking to acquire similar luxuries. Also, one cannot dismiss the power of oral transmission. A description or evocation of characteristic features of French decor may have incited patrons to desire similar elements in their salons, something which may explain why the French and Damascene motifs do not look alike or exactly alike. Motifs selected by Damascene patrons and artists would also have to correspond to local reality and even Muslim traditions. You couldn't have allegories, classical themes, or other such things that we find in Europe. Either verbal evocations or printed material could therefore have been carried back to Damascus by merchants, travelers, or artists. There are several features that betray an unexpected reciprocity between French and Damascene principles of decoration. A love of polychromatic effects for the exterior walls, and in the French cases, they are achieved through the use of white stones, often limestone, rose-colored brick, and bluish slate, whereas in Damascus, we have variously colored limestones again, and the use of black or gray basalt. Then, of course, we have richly decorated wooden paneling and ceilings, coffered or beamed, a great importance given to textiles as major components of the decorative effect, with textiles sharing designs with walls and ceilings, and a passion for collecting and exhibiting valuable and beautiful objects. Perhaps it was these more general common principles that laid the ground for the reception of certain ornamental motifs in Damascus, motifs that may also have struck a note of familiarity in Damascenes. And such was the attachment to the Ajami style in Damascus that it continued much longer than its European counterparts, perhaps because of its local pertinence. 17th century French interiors were a continuation of 16th century décor à la française, which was based on Italian interiors. In the 17th century, paneling and wooden ceilings were to be found in all great rooms. The horizontal divisions of such rooms followed the earlier Renaissance examples for wood revetments that were subdivided into a lower zone, or lambris d'appui, and an upper zone, or lambris d'étage, themselves looking back to Roman domestic decoration. The lower lambris d'appui was decorated with still lifes, flowers, and fruit, including cornucopia, sometimes in trompe-l'œil, and the lambris d'étage, which is we're talking about the lower one here and the upper one there. had paintings of landscapes, vases, grotesques, and other narrative themes, separated by pilasters with garlands. Paneling could have a projecting shelf or entablature that could be used for exhibiting faience or as the base for vases painted in trompe-l'oeil. As in Damascus, a blank wall zone is divided the paneling, if you recall, from the ceilings. So in France, an area called l'attique was given over to canvas paintings, separating the paneling from the wooden ceilings and cornices. And French 17th century ceilings had painted and gilded beams and joints, in my opinion, resembling Damascene examples closely. The wall and ceiling schemes, as well as several of the principal motifs of 17th century French rooms, thus recall those of Damascene case. One special element bears particular mention, namely the overdoor panel, or dessus de porte. While it may be thought to originate in Roman architectural painting, the overdoor is a feature that became almost ubiquitous from the 17th century on in France, as many period interiors, even here in New York, will attest. The panel above doors could feature any type of distinctive ornamentation, carved and gilded in wood or stucco, or painted on canvas set within undulating frames. The well-known architect and theoretician Jacques-François Blondel, writing in 1738, explained that overdoors were employed especially in chambres de parade and salons to give height and importance to the threshold. It is perhaps the overdoor, more than any other element of Damascene Ajami decoration, that speaks of foreign connections, for it is not seen in any other Islamic domestic interior. Although simple, even naive by comparison to its French analogues, the Damascene overdoor is significant proof of the ties that existed between the two decorative worlds. A contemporary decorator's description gives us a good idea of what a 17th century interior, the upper gallery of the hotel, or the Hôtel de Bouillon, painted in 1634 by Simon Vouet, would have looked like. And I have here a photograph of the Damascus room, because I think it sounds a lot like a description of this room. All the wooden paneling will be painted, gilded, and decorated in fruit and flowers with golden backgrounds, and in the central frames will be depicted cities in cameo form. I think it really could be a description of the museum's room. Although it was mythology which triumphed in the French interiors, religious subjects coming in second, examination of surviving examples reveals that landscapes, still lifes, and flowers were extensively employed, and porcelains were painted in trompe-l'oeil. Naturally, only the latter types of ornaments would have interested an Islamic decor. Scholarship has certainly not ignored the importance of Damascene inscriptions, and I am so grateful that Ellen preceded me with this lengthy and very, very detailed description and evocation of the poetry on the Damascus room, so I don't have to explain anything. On the other hand, it is a rather recent story looking closely at inscriptions, and especially in Damascus rooms, where it seems that these poetic inscriptions are a true hallmark of Ajami woodwork, something that is not as common or as pervasive perhaps elsewhere. They seem to be an integral and important part of the decorative scheme here. So as suggested earlier, they seem to have held a special role in the Damascene interior decoration scheme. Imagine what would this room be without the panels of inscription. And that role was perhaps, in a real sense, narrative. And now that we know what these panels say, because Ellen Kenney has preceded me, we can assume that the function of such large-scale inscriptions had perhaps another purpose. In Europe, large-scale figural representations form the principal iconographic themes and therefore the primary ornament. The verses on Damascene walls and cornices conveyed similar themes like the glorification of the owner and his residence or allegorical references to the divine. Sophisticated interiors usually have a story to tell. Given the fact that inscriptions were the only sanctioned Islamic means that the decorative repertoire could employ to illustrate a story, they became one of the key elements of Damascene iconography, analogous perhaps to grand figural ensembles found on European walls and ceilings. Vegetal ornamentation, compositions, and landscapes would then complement and complete the story or create an appropriate atmosphere, just as in the French interiors. In Europe and in France in particular, specially conceived large-scale painting cycles based on literature, mythology, religious and political history provided a narrative and a framework against which to appreciate the distinguished owner of a house. Damascene poetry, as Ellen just said, often created specifically for a given room or to commemorate an occasion, would have held a similar function. Moreover, phrases like, "The mouth of the flowers kiss the cheek of its rose," or "Pray for the chosen one whenever lightning sees the darkness frown and smiles," or yet, "House, rejoice in your loftiness, for he who built you surpasses the planets and stars in glory," all from our room, would have conjured vivid images to viewers' minds comparable to the colorful painted allegories in European rooms. Living beings were evoked in Damascus through words, not painted figural scenes, but the erudite visitors of the time would have been able to understand the messages imparted, just like those visiting the grand residences of Europe, because people in the past possessed the knowledge to decode the meaning of decorative ensembles. For various reasons, modern viewers are perhaps less well equipped to comprehend the subtle meaning of Damascene salons. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that talk. Mecca Baumeister has been conservator at the Metropolitan Museum for almost 25 years. Her primary focus is the treatment of furniture and historic interiors from the Met's Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts. Her background includes an apprenticeship in cabinet making, and her specialty is polychrome wood conservation. For these reasons, Mecca was drafted for the massive project of conserving wood projects in our new galleries. She was especially involved with the study and treatment of the 16th century Spanish ceiling in our collection and the Damascus room under discussion this morning. Today, she's discussing the work of a larger group of conservators at the Met who worked on the Damascus room, and in particular the work of Beth Edelstein and Adriana Rizzo of the Objects Conservation and Scientific Research Departments here at the Met, who are co-authors with Mecca of the study she presents to us now. Thank you.
Good morning, and Marika, thank you for the nice introduction. As we know from the previous two presentations, the Damascus room is a splendid example of a wood-paneled reception room from a private house in Damascus, and it is truly a unique treasure of its time. In the spring of 2008, the Damascus room, also known as Nur al-Din room, was deinstalled and removed from its previous location next to the entrance in the Islamic art galleries. Approximately 2 years later, the room was reinstalled more appropriately within the new galleries devoted to Ottoman art. During those 2 intervening years, a conservation team had the rare opportunity to study this important interior in depth. The room was disassembled into more than 200 elements, of which 164 were woodwork, and arranged in this temporary conservation workspace within the closed galleries. A primary focus of the study of the investigation was the original materials and manufacturing techniques, as well as the changes the room underwent in its 305-year history. In addition, it provided information necessary to carry out much-needed conservation treatment. An important part of the project was a study of Ottoman interiors that remain in their original settings in Syria. This provided the opportunity for conservators to carry out a thorough survey of features that are thought to be missing or altered in the Damascus room. Together with information gathered from other Syrian Ajami rooms in Western collections, a more complete picture of this original appearance, construction, and configuration of the museum's room has emerged. While in Damascus, we were also viewing a number of ruined houses in the neighborhood from which the room supposedly originated, with the hope of finding evidence relating to its provenance. The Damascus room, along with another Damascene interior from a house said to belong to the Quatley family, was purchased in 1933 by the New York dealer and collector Hakab Kevorkian from George Asfa and John Sarkis, dealers based in Damascus. Both interiors were shipped to New York in 1934, but neither was installed until the 1970s, when the Hakab Kevorkian Fund donated the Nur al-Din room to the Metropolitan Museum and the Quatley House interior to New York University's Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies. The sales contract states that the Nur al-Din house was located in Souk al-Harriya and Souk al-Kayatin in the ancient quarters of the city of Damascus. Since our recent research has confirmed that no house of this name existed in the old city, the name most likely refers to the nearby tomb of Nur al-Din, the famous 12th century Syrian conqueror, or other buildings named after him in the same neighborhood. The words Nur al-Din, North Side, are also written in Arabic on the reverse of a photograph taken in Damascus in the early 1930s, prior to the room's disassembly. The name Nur al-Din room has now been replaced by Damascus room, as we heard before, which better reflects the room's still unknown provenance. The interior is exceptional among Damascene period rooms in other museums and private collections because of its integrity. Whereas many other interiors have been significantly altered or augmented to fit new spaces, the Damascus room is preserved in its original dimensions and its woodwork has been changed very little. That said, the study revealed some interesting changes that provide us with an insight into the room's particular history and how it relates to other similar interiors. A few elements of the room are modernizations by the homeowners in the later 18th and 19th centuries, reflecting the shifting tastes in Damascene interior decoration. For instance, the display niche in the center of the east wall, along with the calligraphy panels above it, were added at a later date. At least one pair, if not both, of the flanking decorative panels on each side may date also from this campaign. As already mentioned by Alan Kenney, the poem here is an independent couplet by a different author than the main poem in the room. Further confirming this observation, the materials and decorations of the central elements are different, though clearly intended to mimic the adjacent original wall units. It is quite likely that the east wall of the Damascus room contained a large open niche called yuk, a common feature in these Damascene reception rooms that was used for the storage of bedding, cushions, and other furnishings. Here are some examples of this type of open niche in abandoned historic houses in Damascus. Reception rooms also have a number of different cabinets, such as this large one in the south wall of the Damascus room of a type called samandara. The doors were also modernized, as they are decorated with architectural vignettes in the Turkish Rococo style, along with large gilded central calligraphic medallions. These architectural vignettes are characteristic of the later 18th century and are found in other reception rooms of that time, such as the car at Beit Jacques Montoullon in Damascus, dated to 1790-91. Another element characteristic of later fashions was the inclusion of mirrors. A photograph of the Damascus room's Taza ceiling dating to the early 1930s reveals that there were once 5 mirrors in the square center section, probably dating from the late 18th to the mid-19th century. Today, only the central mirror remains, and the 4 corner ones were replaced with modern Ajami panels. These changes are evident on the reverse of the ceiling panel, and it was probably done shortly after the photo was taken, when the room was being prepared for shipment to New York. This impressive mid-19th century reception room at Beit Mujalid shows the prevalence of mirror decoration at this time, with mirrors in the center of the ceiling and throughout the wall decoration. Other changes in the room relate to the installation at the Met in the 1970s. Photographs dating to 1930s show a series of flat cornice boards originally attached to the top of the wall cornice that were not installed in the 1970s. These boards projected into the room and served as a shelf for the display of objects. As seen here in the car at Beit Sibai, the exposed underside of the cornice boards has a polychrome decoration, which also functions as a visual framing element for the ceiling, provided yet another concentric border to its carpet-like decoration. In this unusual example of a reused reception room, the cornice boards no longer fulfill their original purpose for the display of decorative objects, and instead hold stacks of empty boxes. I am standing here with a shop owner on a second level that was later built into the room to make a storage area, which provided us with the opportunity to examine the cornice boards up close. The cornice boards, formerly belonging to the Met's Damascus rooms, were recently discovered at the Convergence Center at NYU, where they are used to cover the steel framework supporting the library's mezzanines. The stonework of the floors, the fountain, dado, and riser show the most changes from the Damascus room's original appearance. In the 1930s photograph, the stone floor of the ataba had already been removed. The square marble panels with red and white geometric patterns, now placed orthogonally in the Taza floor, come from the flooring of an Ivan in the courtyard of one of the 5 houses in Damascus that belonged to the important Quadli family. Here's a detail of the floor panels, which were part of the purchase when Hakab Kevorkian bought the Damascus room and the Quadli house interior in 1933. Based on surviving examples and historic descriptions, it seems the raised Taza floor of the Damascus room would have originally been made of wooden boards, covered with a carpet in the winter or simply with straw mats in the summertime. The carpets would have echoed the concentric decoration of the Taza ceiling. The room's decorated riser was installed in the 1970s using sections from the inlaid stone risers of the Quadli house interior. The previous Taza riser from the Met's Damascus room, shown in the 1930s photograph, was obtained at a later date by Doris Duke and is now installed at Shangri-La, her former villa in Honolulu, in the so-called baby Turkish room. Interestingly, this inlaid stone riser, as well as the stonework in the ataba dado, probably represent yet another example of the room's modernization in the late 18th or early 19th century, as they are much more representative of this period. An example of a mid-18th century riser, ataba floor, and fountain can be seen in a former reception room in the Al-Azam Palace in Damascus, showing their related designs and use of polychrome marble. Finally, the ataba fountain probably dates earlier than the room itself. 18th century interior fountains were generally higher, as seen in the previous slide and in the reception room at Beit al-Akkad. The fountain might originate from an earlier phase of the Damascus room or another part of the residence, or it might have been added by the dealers when preparing the room for sale. Although we do not have historic photographs of the Masab, the niche located opposite the room's entrance, it is evident that the current configuration is a pastiche of elements from the Damascus room and other sources, including tiles from the museum's collection. The inscription panel bearing the room's date and the trilobed vault filled with gilded muqarnas are the only elements known for certain to be original to the room's Masab. The Masab reflects changes in the room's overall layout in the 1970s installation. At that time, an additional blank panel was, just a second. At that time, an additional blank panel was inserted above the calligraphy panel bearing the date of the room. Because all of the other calligraphy panels in the room are paired, the assumption was made that this was missing its counterpart. However, in all of the other historic rooms with calligraphy wall panels, there is only a single panel above the Masab. A very important discovery is the numbering system on the rebates on the backs of the calligraphy panels, which became visible as we dismantled the room's elements. This numbering system confirmed that there is no missing panel. The black tick marks date to the original creation of the room and would have provided a guide to the proper sequence of the poetry to the installers. A similar system of red tick marks was noted on the cornices bearing calligraphic inscriptions. In addition, all of the room's wooden elements bear another set of numbers, painted in red using Roman and Arabic numerals applied when the room was dismantled in the 1930s. Taking these numbering systems together with the historic photographs of the room, it became evident that the 1970s installation did not reproduce the original arrangement of the wall panels. For example, the entrance originally located in the north wall of the Ataba leading to the courtyard was moved to the west wall because of the space constraints in the galleries. The wall unit with red cupboard doors originally placed in the center of the west wall was displaced and moved to the north wall in the Taza. These changes created a domino effect, requiring the repositioning of many wall elements and disrupting the order of the calligraphy text. The current installation returns the wall units to their original positions and restores the proper order of the calligraphy text. Notably, the entrance section is back in the north wall, though museum visitors still enter the room at the west wall via the large cupboard with the red doors. This allows the room to be accessed from the adjacent Ottoman galleries. The reinstallation also permitted the resolution of some other features in the museum's Damascus room that were missing or altered, allowing for a more accurate reconstruction than was possible in the 1970s. For example, the previous installation, there were no arched window openings on the exterior part of the wall, which in the original setting would parallel the arched openings on the interior. The window niches also lacked the raised curb along the sill that is characteristic of Damascene interiors. And the door was missing its raised threshold. To convey a sense of daylight entering from the courtyard, LED panels were installed behind the entrance and window niches. It is these small details which now contribute to truly replicating the experience of being in a traditional Damascene reception room. All of these architectural changes notwithstanding, one of the most significant change in the room over time has been in the coloration of the decorated woodwork. Today, the surfaces only hint at the dazzling, colorful, and varied appearances they once had, now masked by the layers of darkened varnish, periodically applied while the room was still in use. These details from the ceilings, having been varnished less, convey a sense of what must have been a quite impressive density of pattern and color, though many areas are aged and deteriorated. The varnish layers are clearly evident under illumination with ultraviolet light. One can even see the drip marks in the layers. The extent of the visual change is exemplified by this image showing a once white painted background in the cartouche, which now appears brownish. In the corresponding cross-sections, thick layers of varnish are visible, obscuring the white paint layer. Since the overall appearance of the Ajami decoration is so drastically altered, an important focus of the research project was the accurate understanding of the original decoration techniques and analysis of the original and later materials. The deinstallation facilitated this unique opportunity, representing conservators and scientists with well-preserved areas of paint and glaze without varnishes on protected surfaces. These areas were sampled for analysis and identification of the materials. The wood used for all decorated elements was poplar, while the unpainted framework of the wall paneling is cypress. The poplar panels were prepared with an animal glue size, followed by a ground layer of gypsum bound with animal glue. The calligraphy and designs were then laid out using a thin black paint or transferred with a punched stencil and dry black pigment. These designs were then built up with a gesso paste called Ajami. Gold leaf was used mainly for significant Ajami decorations such as the calligraphy and the medallions, and for the mukanas decoration. Tin leaf was applied over large surfaces and was usually coated with transparent green, red, orange, or yellow glazes to produce shimmering colored effects. These glazes are clearly visible in cross-sections and were identified as an oil-resin mixture. Verdigris was used as a colorant for the green glaze, cochineal for the red glaze, and one of our most important findings was that aloe was used as a colorant for the orange glaze, which had not been previously identified in Syrian Ottoman interiors. The painted decoration was applied after the tin and transparent glazes. In cross-section, both tin and glaze layers are clearly visible beneath the paint. Finally, red and green glazes were applied on top of the opaque paints to add depth and contour to flowers or small decorative motifs, as seen in the detail on the Atava cornices. The original palette combined bright colors with a reflective gold and tin glazed leaf to produce a variety of surface effects. The pigments identified in the paints, lead white, vermilion, red lead, ore pigment, verdigris, smalt, indigo, and a carbon-based black, are consistent with those found in other Ottoman Syrian interiors. Some colors were achieved using these pigments in mixtures. Binding media analysis provided important new information, as we found egg as a medium in all of the paints from the Nur al-Din room that were analyzed. Although previously suggested by other researchers, the use of egg as a binding medium in Syrian interiors had not yet been conclusively established. The composition of the later varnish layers is an oil-resin mixture, like the medium identified in the original glazes. These darkened varnish layers are present on many of these Ottoman Ajami reception rooms, as they received maintenance varnishes while still in use. The bright colors in glazed metal leaf surfaces of the Damascene houses survive in very few instances. The cabinet doors of Beit Haraniya, which were not varnished, help us imagine the appearance of these decorated rooms when they were new. To better demonstrate the original appearance of the museum's splendid Ajami room, two panels of the Damascus room were reconstructed using the techniques and materials identified. The reconstruction dramatically illustrates how the darkened varnishes have altered the appearance of the original surfaces, as seen here on a calligraphy panel or a reproduced section from a cupboard door. Removal of these aged varnish layers is complicated for a variety of reasons. Most significantly, in all areas of orange glaze, the varnish has solubilized and intermingled with the glaze layer. The glaze has been severely disrupted, and we can see by the rough texture with raised darkened islands where the glaze-varnish mixtures contracted as it dried. In cross-section, we can see the mingling of the glaze and the varnish, meaning there is no going back to the original surface. The tin leaf has also corroded, turning black and dull in many areas on both exposed and glazed tin surfaces. On the left, the area of orange glazed tin within the foliate star has darkened considerably. On the right, the intended contrast between tin leaf and gold leaf is compromised by irreversible tin corrosion. Because of the reconfiguration of the room, we had to compensate for the 2 missing panels that are now installed at Shangri-La, which would have featured prominently on the north wall. The actual panels had been cleaned of aged varnish layers. This does demonstrate that the cleaning can be quite successful on many of the decorated surfaces, though the darkened small backgrounds were not successfully returned to their original bright blue appearance. To create replicas to be installed in the room, the 2 panels in Shangri-La were photographed in high resolution, and the images were digitally altered by the museum's photo studio to match the varnished surfaces of the Damascus room. The resulting images were printed on archival paper and adhered to panels of the original shape and dimensions. Just a few more details of the new installation. A metal substructure of steel beams and adjustable framing elements have now replaced the 1970s wooden framework. Large nail holes are visible at varying heights on most styles of the paneling, indicated where hand-wrought nails were originally used to mount the panel to the building's walls. Existing holes were used to match the elements of the room to the substructure with new bolts and screws. Because hand-wrought nails of different sizes would originally have been used, all of the new visible hardware was altered to mimic the original appearance. The dome-shaped bolt head shown here was ground down and patinated, while we made small epoxy caps to disguise the screws that attach the decorative elements to the framework. The screw heads had been exposed in the 1970s installation. The principal value of this study and treatment project has been a greater understanding of the original appearance of the Damascus room in terms of both its surface decoration, which has been significantly altered by later varnish layers, and its layout, which was rearranged in the 1970s and installed with elements from another Damascene house. The new installation reflects more closely the original configuration of this important Syrian reception room. While it would be rewarding to remove or reduce the varnish layers, the technical challenge presented by the interaction of the original materials with the varnish requires further investigation before any steps are taken. Although this reception room has undergone many changes, it still conveys the richness and profusion of decorative detail intended to welcome and impress guests to one of the grand residences of 18th century Damascus. Conservation is an ongoing process, but our work on the Damascus room is done for now, and our wish for this exquisite interior echoes that of the poem, "Remain in happiness, or you unique one of your time." And the second part of this verse contains our wish for you. Enjoy what has been erected with such care for you. Thank you for your attention. And this project would not have been possible without the support and help of many colleagues at the museum and other institutions. Special thanks are also due to all the people who contributed to the study of Syrian Ottoman interiors in their original settings and opened their doors to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mecca. That was fascinating. Just a quick practical note before I introduce our last speaker this morning. We'll have an hour for lunch from 12 to 1 o'clock, And for our speakers today, if you could congregate at the back of the room here, we'll all go to our lunch together. So our final speaker is Stefan Weber, who comes to us from Berlin, where he is the director of the Museum of Islamic Art. He is currently organizing the reconceptualization of the museum, but he also directs research and documentation projects on Damascus, Hama, and Tripoli, and heads the Sayada History Museum on urban history and architecture. His original area of research, however, was Damascus, and his PhD thesis was on the 18th and 19th century urban fabric of the city. The subject of his talk is the period room from Aleppo, Syria, that is in the collection of the Berlin Museum of Islamic Art. So please welcome Stefan.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here, and congratulations for all what you have done to the room. Unbelievable work, very good work. Like all the efforts that can get into the collection, I'm very impressed not only by the reinstallation but also by its conservation and the scientific work along it. Fantastic work here at the Met. I was invited to talk about the grandma of the Damascus room, and I tried to find a family tree and to give you some insights into a very complicated family history. And the grandma which I'm going to present first is the Aleppo room, so-called Aleppo room, the oldest room from Syria and from the Ottoman world that survived in its original form and shape, dated 1600, 1601, and was renewed already 2 years later in 1603. It is unique out of different reasons which I'm going to show, and hard to compare with the Damascus room. First of all, its age is then slightly older, but also the shape is different. It is a proper ka'a, so it has this kind of floor shape, with 3 of these Iwan Tazar elements here around. And I'm coming later to discuss also a few of its elements. The main part of the room, the main Iwan, the most important place to sit, is directly in opposite of the entrance, which is over here, and which also houses then the main features of the Ka'a, which are the beautiful paintings of a Aleppine Christian, a marker, Simsar, called Isa ibn Butros, and beautiful paintings are on the walls. Nothing like this do exist, neither in Aleppo nor in Damascus, with these beautiful paintings of religious scenes like Lady Mary in the temple with Jesus, or the Last Supper, Isaac and Abraham, and here it's Salman and Herodes. Typical scenes which are from the biblical sphere and also can be shared by all the other religions in Aleppo, but also other topics like here, typical way of presenting a garden scene in very, very fine painting. So far we don't have any clue who the painter was, and if he coming from Tabriz or from more Baghdad, very difficult to establish. Still a lot of research to be done here. I hope in 8 years we come up also when we reopen our galleries with a good research on that. Hard to compare also because in the Ottoman Empire every city differs from another. So you cannot go to Damascus and say, now I go to Aleppo and I understand everything, neither to Cairo or to Istanbul. There are very huge differences from one town to the other, mainly based on local building techniques and decoration materials. And, for example, different to the shape of the Ka'a is also, of course, the architectural style, with here the dome on top of the entrance area, the ataba, and the tazas are also not covered by wooden ceiling but by cross vaultings. So the age is different, the city is different, and also the type is different with these paintings, which are unique, as I said, and also the location, the main identification of the room is different to the Damascus room in the Met. The Damascus room now is switched to Damascus. Damascus room at the Met is similar to very typical rooms which are on site of the courtyard. Just to give you a way into the houses, here are the hlis with a way into the courtyard from the streets. Here, this one of another Quwatli house. And you have then the rooms like the rooms of the Metropolitan Museum on site, sometimes also on the top side of the rooms, but of the courtyard. This T-shaped kaa, which is here on the ground floor, we have to step up to go to the proper kaa, is then not that what is here, but more a kind of very elegant room on the side of the courtyard. So also the room type is different. You have cars in Damascus which do not have three tazas, three kind of areas, seating areas, like here, later in the 1860s changed Ka'a of Beit Quwatli, another one, but the Beit Quwatli, the Quwatli family took over all these houses only in the 1860s. So we're talking for all the establishment of the houses, certainly of another family, and I was very happy to hear about the Ashraf history, which fits very well. However, there are cars like this. It could be also a car of a house, was probably like here at the Quwatli house, where we have different smaller rooms which are beautifully decorated with the Ajami panels. We have a similar situation to think of also in the house which were in the Nuruddin quarter in Damascus. So if I said I cannot directly compare, we at least can go into the family history, and I will now go with you a bit through the family tree of the main elements, not of the architectural type, which I'm very interested in, but more in the decoration, not in the Ajami, in the Ablak, but in the Ajami decoration. And as this was already noticed, it's very difficult to establish a family history as none of the Mamluk and pre-Mamluk interiors survived in Damascus, and we have from the Mamluk period only ceilings, and Damascus only 2 ceilings that I know of from the Mamluk period. So we don't know actually how a Damascene room was looking like before 1700. We have no idea how the interior decoration, wooden decoration would look like. We can only think a bit about how the ceilings do look like in the period before, where we have some. But when we look back to the establishment of a history, we have to go back to Cairo and, of course, think of how the interconnections between Durqa on the one hand side from the Cairene setting, the Mamluk setting, and certainly also the woodwork are interrelated. We have another school of architectural forms from the east coming over from Iran with the Ka'a type shape, which is more influential for Aleppo, but also meets in Damascus with the Mamluk type. However, if we come back to the interior decoration, then we have certainly looked to establish more closely and research the existing Mamluk and early Ottoman houses of Cairo, and so far there is no detailed research done on the interior decoration of these houses. Very promising research field. Because this continues up into the Ottoman period, where we have similar influences of Ottoman decoration, which I do come to in a minute. In Aleppo, we are slightly better off, but only slightly, because we have few panels from the late 16th and early 17th century preserved in the Pharaon collection today, which shows clearly how important Ottoman language of decoration was for these panels. But if you go to Istanbul yourself and you try to find something like, for example, at the Dikka from the Sokolo Mehmet Pasha Mosque, or if you go to the same Dikka, same element in the Silimaniye Mosque, you will find wooden painted elements, but there's no house existing except one, the Mujazadeh Yalısı, coming from the period before the heavy European influence in the middle of the 18th century. So when everything we talk about the early 18th century, we have no idea, because there is no existing material, how the Ottoman interiors in the central would have influenced the Syrian region. Because this, what you see here, is obviously a language of Ottoman decoration with the south leaves and the cloud bands, but this is not transported directly onto Syrian interiors. The elements, single flower elements, yes. And of course, when we go into the 18th century and we go into Aleppo, one cannot explain these Aleppine interiors and the decoration without seeing what happened in the 18th century city of Istanbul, and next to the Amuzazadeh, of course, and the palace, Topkapi Palace, especially with the Yemiş Odası of Ahmed III. We can find different elements and also on other material like fabrics, Carol books covers, and other elements. Of course, one can find how these forms were coming from the Ottoman mainlands into Aleppo and Damascus. But again, here the floor, the way of how the panels are set into the house is quite different from the Damascene way to do it. As I said, every city has a local school as well. I want to go forward, but this does not want to go forward with me. I go backwards, doesn't go backwards. Maybe the battery is empty, or I put it on.
We'll reset it, we'll get it.
Okay. So we have more time to look at them. Okay. What I actually wanted to show, which is not working on this slide, is then how this local school then developed also in peripheries of the peripheral centers, like, for example, here the Aleppo school in Antakya. You can find similar things in Hama, Homs, and so on. But the main bulk of material is coming from Aleppo, from Damascus, and you saw all the Damascene rooms in the US, but also in very different European collections all over, also in Beirut houses, all over the region you'll find Damascene interiors. And just a survey of houses that I visited, so you see in gray houses that I visited, and I was focusing on the post-Ajami school of decoration, so about the 19th century school of decoration. But while visiting houses, of course, I recorded where I could find Ajami, and this quarter here is all reconstructed in the 19th century, and 2/3 of houses were remodeled in the 19th century. But still, we have quite a number of Ajami rooms in situ, here marked in green. And I think that we have also not only with big houses like the Azam house, also very small houses do have beautiful interiors. And if I zoom my back into the 18th century, I have to think that to rethink the notion of urban society as we normally have it from the Middle East. There we can think, or can certainly, when we look into Damascus or Aleppo or Cairo, talk about cities which a large urban bourgeois society, which a very strong middle and upper middle class, which paid very much money into the decoration of the houses, and there were many houses, hundreds of houses, decorated with this beautiful way of interiors. But I think that shifts a bit our perception of urban strata and societies in the Middle East in the pre-modern period. Now I want to go further. Yeah, of those who survived, the Damascus room here and the Met would be here. So there are the Met is older than the oldest one in situ, but the bulk of the rooms which are still existing and in situ are from the late 18th and early 20th century, when we have an enormous shift of interior understanding and decoration, and it's then only that we have the European influence via Istanbul from the 1770s on. So there's no figural painting, landscape painting before the 1770s. And then we have, which actually appeared in Istanbul first time in the late 1740s. very typical for Damascus, and we have here one of the very few ceilings which I would date around 1600. Very typical for Damascus is that we have here this Ajami paste, which is slightly giving a kind of three-dimensional flavor to the painting. It's not just only painting, it's light relief structure which you find on the ceilings and the walls, and this from quite early on, which is not the same in other cities. Okay, now coming from the family affairs to a more pleasure part of the presentation, house music, because most of the houses that we have in that area we find today as empty spaces. Everything what was in there is almost gone, and if we go back to some other areas and having picture representations of interiors, we can see that, of course, everything what we have in a museum, not always upper class material, but or royal material, but very often good carpets, good ceramics, and if you know that most of the museums do have at least 60% of their collection ceramics, you understand that we have to imagine this room also of middle and upper middle classes, income strata classes, with quite many nice objects. And today we have only very few houses which can represent this idea here in Cairo with the Beit Suhaimi, which was then of very upper classes. We can turn the music again out. Okay, thank you. Because it's empty and the social practice is missing. But of course we have to think about not only interior decoration, but all the tangible and intangible objects or elements which are part of the concert in these rooms, which are here, and I think they're very, very nicely made by light. You have, of course, a special light coming special in summertime into the room. So if you sit there in a room and you're coming to a house in summer, it is beautiful to sit in a room, not only because there's shadow, because it gives a nice, very nice light. You have the water, and you have the noise of water. You have the blossoming trees, and you have the idea of smell. You smell, especially in jasmine in the evening, and beautiful orange flowering. So you have a very multisensual experience in these rooms, which belong to the experience of these houses if you live in it. And here this I took from Anke Scharas. As we know, this inside-outside, which I tried to also present here in the last slide, with the inside-outside experience, all the cars, they have, if ever possible, a garden in front, and if you are very rich, you even try to have a car or on the river or into the gardens, or if you are on the countryside, in the valleys, in the surrounding. So flower elements, floral elements, are part of this multisensual experience, and it is a topos in itself in Islamic art. And I think it's not only the paradise garden, it's not in an eschatological way, but on the very down-to-earth pleasure of time where you live in. I want to go on, but they like the flowers. Okay, to go a bit back to Aleppo, next to these flowers you have depiction of many things which is around in your cosmos, and this can be Sufi scholars, this could be a European lady, or fantastic beasts, which Karen Rödans was so very nicely decoding, while we normally as art historians call this Xiling. She said, no, this is not a proper Xiling, this is more a Sanaja. The Xiling is, of course, the Chinese origin of the iconography, but the semantic value of it is a Sanaja, and she went back to old Sanajas, and this is a Sanaja from the Razvini, the cosmography of the Ajaib from Razvini from 1280, so still in his lifetime. The form changed, but she could prove that in the, let's say, in the cosmos of literate societies in the Middle East, this what you have here as a lion shilling is actually what had in 1280 somebody else painted slightly different, but is a beast beyond Tibet which can kill you while it's looking at you, so watch out. And you have other fantastic beasts. Some of us, of course, are so familiar with the phoenixes and the simorghs, especially if you look to the Shahnameh and other beautiful things. But very nice is also the deer killing, which is the sea cow, which is also, of course, from the Chinese iconography, but Karen Rödans could prove that this is in the understanding of the time an animal here coming from Tusi, which comes out of the river of the water to bring treasures. So this is a very good animal to meet. But very important, and this is something what also Persis Bernekamp is talking about, is this is not something which is alien and different and which is beyond your cosmos of existence, but this is part of a very logically ordered cosmos, which is based on Neoplatonic orders of beings, of being. And so while we looking at this beast, I want to say it's not only that you look into something very strange and very different, but you look actually to some elements of the overall order created by God. So, but other orders are much more important, I think, while looking into the rooms, which are then social order, because and this, you said it already, it's very important to understand how this room functions, and no room exists without social praxis. And these rooms were made, of course, as stages for social praxis. And the majlis, the meeting in the evening, was something which you find throughout the centuries. And sometimes in the morning, we have descriptions of it, how people read in the morning for business, made more business, and then in the evening gather in the same rooms for having more pleasure. And all elements, tangible and intangibles, of these rooms, might it be the interior decoration, the connection inside, outside, the floral design, how you dress, how you sit, what you smoke, how you talk, how you move your head, how you hold your hand, the coffee cup, how you have the other hand. All this is part of a very elaborated concept of elements. These are extremely important to get it right if you want to be one of the very important persons of a city, the notables, the ayan. And if you one thing to do wrong, you will have problems. And all the time, when you have periods when you have social change, these notions of what is good to be part of this noble part of society changed, and there are always ways and also ideas of how social change do evolve in change of fashion, into change of what you dress, what you put on, how you talk, and what you listen to. And this, if you don't, that always upcoming social upwards looking people, if they try to copy it, how to find a way to be one of those who really know what is right and what is wrong. And I love this citation from Mustafa Ali, where he really says, and he is really afraid that due to this change in society, social order can be disturbed. He said, if really people put on their wrong things and will want to be of another social strata, you should really punish them. And while reading his lines, and you can really read out of the lines how he is so anxious that the social order of the city of that Cairo and here at the same time like Aleppo room could be disturbed. So also we then going to for the reconstruction in 2019, and we hope we can learn a lot from you, and we will certainly discuss with you a lot how you did this beautiful work and find notions and ways of how we can make our Aleppo room as nice looking as you did, and bring also some life into these ancient halls. Thank you for listening.
seen that Annie, Christine, and Stefan proposed slightly different antecedents for this type of room and its paintings, and I was wondering if you could respond to each other's talks, whether there was a difference because maybe, as you suggested, each city has a different history and specific cultural location. Would you see a connection to Europe at all? Or is the Aleppo room earlier than the period that Annie Christine was dealing with?
The question is here really which time we're talking of. So when 1707, we're still talking about a period before the European influence in the Ottoman Empire, and there was no consulate, European or French consulate in Damascus, opened only in 1830s. So I don't see at all a European influence that early, which comes later, and the European influence which do come with the vignettes in the walls, they do appear in the 1770s in a proper reflection which happens throughout the empire of the new wall paintings, which are a copy of European wall paintings in Istanbul, which appeared in 1750. And the foreign, we have more also in many cities of the Ottoman Empire, a reflection of the tulip style, which has not yet, the tulip was always present, but about the new style of decoration, which is from the early 18th century. The problem is that the only building which could be the missing link, there's no house of the early 18th century in Istanbul, but the only one is now under examination, and it has wall panels which are very close to the Syrian interiors.
This question has nothing to do with, I mean, because of what is going on in Syria, do we have news about whether any of the houses are have been destroyed or anything like that?
The heavy fightings are not in the old cities, so there is no, as far as to my knowledge, there's no destruction of houses in the old city. In Homs, which are the main, where the biggest problems are happening right now, it's in the modern quarters with the concrete buildings. But Hama, of course, since 1982, when we had the first uprising against Assad, we have lost that time 80% of the old city. But this is almost 30 years ago. But we have for sure daily losses of the houses, and Mecca showed it so impressively that the houses in Syria are under very big danger, and every year we cannot go and do surveys. I think it's when I was preparing the paper, I was really thinking one has to go with an army of scholars to document as much as possible, because many houses do collapse or are wrongly restored. They rediscovered the old cities right now, there are new restaurants and hotels, but the restoration which is done is harming the houses at least as much, if similar to as if you destroy them. And unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
I guess it's a question for Stefan mainly. In your survey of the early Ottoman architecture, have you found another reception room, another car that is in plan similar to Aleppo room? Because it struck me, the Mamluk period the architecture is missing, but what struck me, the similarity of the plan and disposition to the Nasrid architecture.
There's two lines in it. We don't know yet how they belong together. There's the, if I go really back in time, Sassanid-Safavid connection, so the Timurid, what is coming from Iran, from the east. And you have then, of course, which came before from the Iran to the east to Cairo, and then comes to Syria. And these elements of cars, they do meet. There are a lot of new cars that we found in the surveys, which are four-winged cars with a dome on the top, similar like the Çinli Köşk, which is, of course, itself reflection of Iranian architecture. And this you can, we documented quite a lot, and Dennis Bayazit, also here from the Met, I had the pleasure to join her in one campaign in the region of Mardin. We found beautiful, also T-shaped and cross-shaped cars from the 15th and 16th century. But it's still, let's say, we surveyed, but not analyzed yet properly, and there's still a lot of material out which we have to bring together and then analyze properly. But there is much more on pre-Ottoman and early Ottoman architecture in the region as we know of so far.
So could you say that there is actually a whole group of example of the T-shaped cars?
T-shaped and cross-shaped cars, yeah, quite a lot.
Thank you.
20, 30.
If you are naming my name, so I just wanted to add that these examples actually, one can even date them back to 14th or 13th century. That's dated with stylistic analysis. So.
I'd like to visit your museum, but 2019 seems a long way away. What's open now, and what is, if one went to Berlin today, what could one see? Okay.
You still see what is built in 1932. The Islamic collection was reopened after unification in 2001 and will stay open until 2018. So we close a few months before we open, since we're moving only into another wing and tripling space, which is fantastic for us. And we have now, the wing which we're moving to will be cleared off this year. And we will have the next 8 years of planning and doing the new exhibition galleries. But meanwhile, you can still see the old one, which are really not bad.
I was interested in this issue of wall paintings, and to the extent that the Aleppan rooms actually show really Persian-style wall paintings, and that there seems to be a kind of a cordon sanitaire between that and the Damascus school. Is that actually that clear? This is really the first time that I sort of realized that do we actually have to draw this kind of curtain? And of course, this means that Persian, so you have Persian poetry, but not Persian imagery being manipulated here. And how does that, how does that really function? And actually I'd like also Anne-Christine to, I mean, both of you should actually talk about this because I'm interested in, and by the way, a lot of Islamic houses have imagery, so let's not, deal with it in this way.
Yeah. Aleppo is unique. Not Aleppo. This room is unique. We don't find in Aleppo, neither in Damascus nor somewhere else, similar paintings in the Syrian region around that date. First, and second, if we find paintings on walls on wood, they are all floral. There's only one. Deer Qingling from Beirut, which comes from a house in Damascus, and we have a few lines in Ajami, also from the 18th century, in Lebanon and in Damascus. But there is a clear cut between this room and all the other rooms because there is no direct similar painting in any of the rooms in the Syrian region. Number one. And in Damascus, we have the first vignette set in the 1770s. There is no landscape painting before. And the first wall paintings do come up in 1800 around. The first famous one is dated around 1830s. So when I have to say. So in 1750s, the Ottomans started in Istanbul with their wall paintings. This is reflected in the Ajami and from the 1770s, and changed from the Ajami to the walls in the 1830s. And from the 1830s, when the Ajami stops to be produced, Ajami will be gone then. You have all the wall paintings then transferred directly on the walls, and you have huge, large wall paintings in Damascus from that period, especially from the 1860s and 70s.
Well, yes, I think there is a separation between Aleppo and Damascus. There are different distribution, different layout, different articulation of the parts. And as for the paintings, as we saw, they're not excepting the Berlin room, which is exceptional in every way. They are different, their backgrounds. It's not so much the green background that we saw in our Damascus room here. Aleppo has lighter backgrounds, like white colors, etc. It's not this very codified. Damascus, in my opinion, is much more codified, much more repetitive. You can easily find yourself, you can easily enter a Damascene room and know that you're in a Damascene room. It doesn't have that many differences and variations in the layout. It does in the motifs. As for the landscapes, I have a feeling that they did have some, that they did use discreetly landscape paintings, little vignettes, vedute, even earlier than when Stefan is saying, but we don't have actual surviving examples. We do have descriptions of such things existing by visitors, at the time, and also, some perhaps lost rooms that we don't have anymore. So they may have started in a small scale painting these small vedute into these rooms earlier than what we have surviving. But certainly Aleppo is different from Damascus overall, and I think every Ottoman city has its own particular flavor based on its traditions and its own way of life.
Thank you all. We'll have to stop the discussion here and break for lunch, and let's reconvene at 1. Thank you to the speakers.